Hello everyone and welcome to the last game we'll be showing from the chorus tournament of 2010. It's a game from the final round, round 13. It is Magnus Carlsen versus Fabiano Caruana. And yes, Fabiano is younger than Magnus. He is, I believe, 17 or maybe even 16. No, I think he's 17 years old at the time this game was played. Magnus is 19. And, well, you can see even the rating difference is pretty huge. 28-10 Magnus, 26-75 for Fabiano. But as you'll see in this game, even in 2010, Fabiano was definitely an incredible player, as he does faces Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces here. But you all know that in 2018, the two of them will face off in a World Chess Championship match. And today, I'm recording this video on the 16th of March 2024. Fabiano is rated number 2 in the world. He's the only 2800 player aside from Magnus Carlsen. But yeah, let's return to this game. It is one of the most talked about games from the tournament, the most analyzed one, especially at the time when it was played, because, well, there was just a lot to consider, and there were really, really difficult lines to calculate, even though there were strong engines at that time. Ripka was used, and people, could use it to analyze some positions, but they didn't trust the engine completely. So we're gonna do it with 2024 engines and see what they missed. So let's check it out. Magnus with the white pieces opens with pawn to e4, and you all know that Magnus won this tournament, so that's pretty clear. But he still needs to do well in this game against Fabi in order not to mess up in the final round. So e4, we have pawn to e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. Magnus goes for the Ruy Lopez, and a6 Morphy's defense. We have bishop to a4, knight to f6, we have pawn to d3, and now this is the Anderson variation of the Ruy Lopez. Those of you who have seen my Morphy saga know why it's called the Anderson variation. d6, we have pawn to c3, and pawn to g6. We have knight b to d2, bishop to g7, and knight to f1. So very standard stuff. You could easily see this being played today. We have castles, bishop to g5, pinning the knight, and now h6 is the top move nowadays and the top move recommended by the engine. But here we have pawn to d5, the early pawn to d5 by Fabi. I have no idea if it was the norm back in 2010, or maybe just used this Fabi as a surprise for this game, but it is very rare. And here we have queen to e2, and it is now, as of move 10, that this position has never been reached again. Okay, queen to d6, developing the queen, preparing to connect the rooks and bring the rooks into the game, and now bishop captures on f6. You played, the queen comes to d6 to defend the e5 pawn, because you could easily just open up the e file, remove one of the defenders of the e5 pawn, and then just snatch a pawn. So this is nicely defending the e5 pawn, but now bishop captures on f6. Magnus gives up one of the bishops and says that, okay, now you can't capture with the queen as the d pawn would fall. So bishop captures on f6, and now knight to e3. Again, just putting pressure on d5, forcing Fabi to make a decision. Does he advance the pawn? Does he capture on e4? Fabi just plays knight to e7. He adds more the defense to d5 and also prepares c6 to improve his central position. Of course, if he takes or advances, then he loses his nice center. So bishop back to b3, again putting more pressure, and c6. And here Magnus has a variety of options. He could just castle and play a nice calm game. He could go rook to d1 and wait to see what Fabi will do, but he goes for pawn to h4. He wants to take down his younger adversary. And okay, bishop to e6, Fabi continues development. He's not eager to rush with pawn to h5, and Magnus goes knight to g5, puts pressure on the bishop on e6, so bishop to d7, and only now rook to d1. We have rook 8 to d8, and now queen to f3. Again, you could go for a nice castle here, which calms down the game, or you could move the knight back with knight to f3. But no, Magnus goes queen to f3, and he prepares a very, very tricky maneuver, as the only piece defending the bishop on f6 is the queen on d6. But the question is, what does Magnus have planned if Fabi plays pawn to h6 and attacks the knight on g5? That is the question. And Fabi asks it, well, by actually advancing the pawn. Now, the problem is, by playing queen to f3, you've taken up the f3 square from the knight, and also if you move the knight back to h3, then you just give up the h4 pawn. Which, okay, you could argue that now you have the semi-open h file for the rook, but there's really nothing concrete here. So Magnus's idea behind this queen to f3 move and inviting h6 is knight to c4, and probably the position I'm going to use for the thumbnail, as it is a really weird move. But the idea is what we've discussed. You want to kick away the queen from the defense of the bishop on f6. Now, of course, if the queen moves, you're just going to take the bishop. So the knight has to be captured. D captures on c4, and now D captures on c4 opens up an attack towards Fabi's queen. Knight to d5. Fabi not, of course, in a rush to give up the bishop on f6 and then run into some sort of checkmating pattern. He just plays knight to d5. He wants to give back the knight and just have a very enjoyable position, still putting pressure on the knight on g5. So Magnus brings the knight back, knight to h3. Of course, he will win the knight. You can't move. The knight, the queen is on d6, and now pawn to h5. Queen to g3. And now bishop to g4, putting pressure on the rook. Well, when the queen was on f3, bishop to g4 would definitely win the rook. So now bishop to g3 can be parried, but you could also consider pawn to f3. Pawn to f3 would be so bad that I simply have to show you what happens if you play pawn to f3. If you play pawn to f3 here, well, it's a hypothetical position. It didn't happen in the game, but do you see how Fabi wins the game here? Have a crack at it while I give you a couple of seconds. So, for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on looking for stuff like this in your own games as well. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is queen to e7. And there's really not all that much you can do about bishop captures on h4. Even though the bishop on g4 is hanging, and you can even play knight to f2 to sort of stop the skewering, now comes knight to f4. And it's just lost whatever you play. You could even trade a pair of rooks. For example, captures, still no move here. Even if you take the bishop, now comes, look at this, even worse. Bishop captures on h4, and once everything gets captured, black temporarily sacrifices the queen, and after queen captures, knight captures on g2 check, wins back material. King to e2 or f1, doesn't really matter, knight captures, you're up the exchange, you're up a pawn, and you're going to win the game very nicely. So f3, not working here, and of course Magnus doesn't play it. He plays rook to d2. You don't get to be 2800 by playing moves like f3. So bishop captures on h4, and now comes queen captures and queen to f6. And what's the defense here? What can Magnus do? Well, of course, he has to trade queens, and that will liberate the knight from d5. Queen captures on f6, or you could go queen to g3, but then the knight comes to f4, and Fabi is just winning this. So after queen to f6, queen captures on f6 was played, knight captures, and now knight to g5. With pawn to c5, keeping the pawns doubled nicely on the c file, and now pawn to f3. Now you can kick away the bishop, bishop back to c8, and now bishop to a4, making room for the b pawn to be pushed forward. King to g7, now comes rook captures on d8, rook captures, and pawn to b4 by Magnus. And this is a bit of a risky move. Usually I say that this move wins every game, but here it's the move that potentially loses you the game, but only if you analyze a position that both Magnus and Fabi could not analyze properly while this game was played. Feel free to pause the video and try to find the only path to victory for Fabiano here while I give you a couple of seconds. Yes, for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on playing better than the two gentlemen who will play a World Chess Championship match in 2018. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the move is not rook to d3, the move that Fabi played, but rather knight back to d7. Just incredible how many knight to d7 moves happened in this game, and now when it was crucial, it did not happen. It looks like a weird move, but as Ivanchuk once said, the hardest move to find is with the knight back. The problem is it gives you a tremendous boost in the position, and white really doesn't have a good way of continuing. Now, let's just enjoy this position for a second and figure out why it's so powerful. Well, let's say you take the knight. So let's say even that can be played. Let's say rook captures on d7, and now you advance the king. You want to bring the rook into the game. Now comes king h6. you attack the knight, and once the knight moves, you will play c captures on b4, and once c captures on b4 is played, you will play rook to d4, and now you're starting to win material. And if rook to c1, defending the pawn on c4, now you will play bishop to e6, and there's no way for you to stop losing material. And it's not only that, okay, you can play a3, bishop captures on c4, check, king t1, now h4. White's position is just bad. You will play b5, you will bring the rook further in, you will start winning more material, so that is completely winning. So after knight to d7, you can't just capture the knight. So what are your other options? Well, okay, you can play king e2, and you can bring the rook into the game. Obviously, that can happen. Now, black would play king to f6, and Fabi's knight, Magnus's knight really doesn't have a good plan here. You could go knight h7 check, or you could go knight to h3. So it seems a bit more reasonable to go back, so let's check that first. If you go knight to h3, then knight to b6 happens, and now the c4 pawn will fall. Or you defend it, and then comes bishop to e6. Again, the c4 pawn will fall, and if b captures on c5, doesn't really matter. You'll just play knight captures on c4, and that's it. Next, the knight is nicely defended here. You can't really go for it with anything. And next, the c pawn will fall, and it's a doubled c pawn. Both of them are on dark squares. They will be easy targets that Fabi will be able to win in the near future. So after king to f6, what you could do is go knight to h7 check, but there's also a problem. Here, king to e7 would be played. And now the threat is f6, taking away the g5 square from the knight, and the knight will be trapped. There's no way to stop that. So what can you do? You can capture on d7, but we already know that that doesn't work. We can even check bishop captures. You're going to play rook captures, and now after, let's say, rook to d1, you will capture the rook, and after king captures, again f6 would trap the knight. So that doesn't work. What you could do is play knight to g5, but now knight to b6, and here you could, move the bishop back. The bishop is under attack. Bishop to b3. Again, f6, you chase away the knight. Capturing first on c5 doesn't really help you. Knight to d7, and you have tripled pawns, which will just fall, so it doesn't really matter. Knight to h3, and after bishop to e6, going after the c4 pawn once again. B captures on c5, and now you could capture on c4, but you can even play knight to d7, and now everything will just start dropping. The tripled c pawn structure does not work well for the game. So after b4, that was the way for Fabi to look for advantage. He went for another move, which is very, very strong. It's the second move recommended by the engine, but it just doesn't give him the advantage that he needed. Or maybe, if he plays it perfectly, it might be enough. So let's see what happened. Magnus played b captures on c5, which looks just terrible, tripling your pawns like this. Rook captures on c5 with king to d2. Now rook captures on c4. Bishop to b3, and the rook captures on c5. So, like I said, the pawns aren't really impressive. You had the rook made easy meal of all three of them. Knight captures on f7, and now pawn to a5. So, okay, Fabi is up a pawn, and he will still be pushing for the win here. Rook to c1. Now comes rook captures on c1, king captures, and pawn to a4, trying to dislodge the bishop from the defense of the knight, or rather deflect the bishop from the defense of the knight on f7. Bishop to c4, and now pawn to b5 with the exact same idea. And now there is nothing more for Magnus to do. He has to play knight to d6 and go for this endgame being a pawn down. It's already an endgame being a pawn down, but he's going into a simplified form of this endgame being a pawn down. B captures, knight captures, and now pawn to h4, grabbing more space, stopping that pawn on g2. And now if the knight can somehow go after it, you capture the g2 pawn, and the h pawn marches forward. Magnus lost the game. So knight to b6. Magnus also goes after the pawns here, and now comes knight to h5 with the plan that we discussed. Knight captures on c4, and now king to f6. Interestingly, you could also play knight here, but then knight captures on e5, and after knight captures on g2, there's knight to g4, which controls the h2 square. So there isn't a quick way to go about this. So king to f6 by Fabi brings his king into the game, as you should always do in an endgame. King to d2, now comes knight to f4. We have king to e3, even giving up the g2 pawn with check. knight captures, and king to f2. So Magnus decides to defend his king side with the king, knight to f4, and now knight to b2, going after the a4 pawn, a3, now knight to c4, going after the pawn, and knight to d3 with check. King g2, now comes king to g5. We have knight captures on a3, king to f4, and now knight to c2. And it again looks very dangerous. But here is knight to b2. Stopping the pawn from being advanced to a4, knight to b4, and now pawn to h3 with check, winning this pawn, and then the plan is to advance the g pawn. King captures, and now king to h4, stopping pawn to g5, and now king to f4. And it really looks like Fabi's pawn will just start marching forward, and that's the end of it. However, knight to d5 with check, king captures on e4, and knight to and the knight to e7. Now giving Fabi the move, but there is no good move to be made here. So king to f3, trying to get the pawn marching down the board, even at the expense of the g pawn. Magnus captures it, now pawn to e4. We have knight to e5 with check, king to f4, and the knight to g4. And here Fabi just played knight to a4, and he was in this position on move 56 that Fabi and Magnus agreed to a draw, as there was nothing more to be done here. The problem is, if you went for pawn to e3 here, there's the simple knight captures on e3, and of course it's a draw by insufficient material. As soon as the pawn marches forward, the knight will capture it, and that's it. You cannot checkmate the white king with only a king and a knight. So here knight a4 was played, and the game ended, but for the same reason. For example, pawn to a3, you're going to play knight to b6, Magnus would sacrifice the pawn, and after that's been done, let's say knight to f6 goes after the pawn, and now the plan is just to give up the knight for the pawn, and if the pawn marches forward, then you deliver a check, and after king f3, knight captures, king captures, and it will be a draw by insufficient material. In my opinion, the best kind of draw. Very nicely done by both of them. Fabi definitely had huge winning chances in this game, but it's such a huge rating gap, and playing in the tournament in those days, it was very, very strange for there to be someone younger than Magnus in a super tournament. Last time Magnus faced a player younger than himself in any tournament was back in 2008. Where he faced Ho Yifan, but that was a rapid event. Let's check out the standings one more time. So these were the standings of the Chorus Tournament of 2010. Magnus won with 8.5 out of 13. 5 wins, only 1 loss. You all know which one it was, as you've been watching the coverage, and 7 draws. The only other player with 5 wins is Alexei Shirov, but he lost 2 games. The only player with 0 victories, Nigel Short, with 5 out of 13. And the only player in the tournament without a single loss is Vishwanathan Anand. An amazing tournament for Magnus, but also decent tournament for young Fabiano Caruana, ends on 5.5 out of 13, as he did lose 3 games in this event. That's the short coverage of the Chorus 2010 from the perspective of former world classical champion Magnus Carlsen. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any games that you would like to see, I might cover some others as well. And if you have any suggestions from any active events that are currently happening in the chess world, do use that hashtag suggestion, as it really helps me out. I would like to thank John Anderson, Luke Donato, John Tardif, BulletChessThriller.com, and Alexandra Aldrich for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check upon your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.